Warren Holt slid the folder across the hospital tray like it was nothing, like the woman lying there with 12 stitches in her leg and an IV in her arm was a problem to be managed, not a person who had just taken a bullet's worth of shrapnel throwing herself in front of a dying Marine. "Sign it," he said, his voice smooth as oil on water. "Take the paid leave. Let this whole thing disappear." Claire Maddox stared at the folder. Then she stared at him, and something in the room changed, because Warren Holt had no idea who he was talking to, and in 24 hours, he was going to find out the hard way. If you want to see what happens when a man like that tries to bury a woman like her, stay with me until the very last second of this story. Drop a like right now and leave a comment telling me what city you're watching from. I want to see how far this goes. The second bullet wasn't meant for her. That was the thing Claire Maddox kept coming back to in the hours afterward, when the adrenaline had drained out of her and the pain in her leg had settled into something grinding and permanent. The bullet wasn't meant for her. It was meant for the young man in the dress uniform, sitting at the counter of Remy's diner, nursing a coffee he'd barely touched, staring out the window at the gray West Virginia morning like he was trying to remember what normal felt like. Claire had noticed him the second she walked in. Old habit, she noticed everyone. She'd taken the booth in the back corner, the one with sight lines to both the front door and the kitchen, the one where her back was to the wall and her eyes were to the room. She'd ordered black coffee and scrambled eggs and told herself to stop cataloging the exits. She wasn't in Mosul. She wasn't in Ramadi. She was in Harlan, West Virginia at 6:45 in the morning, after 18 hours on her feet in the emergency room of Harlan County Medical Center, and all she wanted was food and silence. The young Marine at the counter had his rank tab on his sleeve. Corporal, 23, maybe 24. The kind of straight back and tight jaw that said he was either fresh out of training or fresh out of somewhere he was still trying to leave behind. Claire recognized that too. She recognized it the way you recognize your own reflection in a window you didn't expect to find. She looked away, picked up her coffee, told herself he wasn't her problem. The bell above the door chimed at 6:52. 3 men walked in. Claire's fork stopped halfway to her mouth. Not because of how they looked exactly. They looked ordinary enough. One tall and wiry in a black jacket, one shorter, built like a dock worker, red cap pulled low. The third, barely out of his teens, pale and twitchy, hands shoved into the front pocket of a gray hoodie. What stopped Claire was the way they moved. They didn't scan the menu board. They didn't look for open seats. Their eyes went straight to the people. She set her fork down very carefully. Her coffee mug was still in her left hand. Her right hand moved to the edge of the table, slow and quiet, and she pressed her fingertips flat against the laminate surface, the way she used to press them against the earth when everything was about to go wrong and she needed to feel something solid. The tall one reached into his jacket. "Everybody shut up and get down on the floor right now." The voice cracked through the diner like a rifle shot. The handful of early morning customers flinched hard. A woman in the corner booth knocked her orange juice off the table. The old man at the far end of the counter started to stand, and then thought better of it and sat back down. The waitress, Carol, according to the name tag, went the color of dry plaster and took one slow step backward toward the kitchen door. The stocky one in the red cap fired into the ceiling without warning. The sound was enormous in the enclosed space. A physical force that hit you in the chest before your brain processed what it was. Someone screamed. The contractor 2 booths over dropped to his knees so fast he cracked them on the tile and didn't seem to notice. The woman in the corner booth was already under the table, pulling her purse with her. Claire did not move. She was running a grid. She'd been running it since the moment they walked in, and she just confirmed what she already suspected. 3 hostiles. Semi-automatic pistol on the tall one, confirmed. Second weapon on the stocky one, now confirmed and recently discharged. The twitchy kid in the hoodie, probable third weapon, hands too deep in that pocket, posture too rigid. He was the unpredictable one. His eyes were jumping around the room like a cornered animal, and his finger was doing something she didn't like against whatever was in that pocket. 7 civilians, including herself. 2 exits, front and kitchen. The kitchen door was closer to Carol, who had pressed herself against the prep counter and looked like she might faint. The front door was 30 feet behind the 3 men. Neither exit was viable right now, not with the stocky one scanning the room with his chin up and his chest out, looking for a reason. He found one. His eyes landed on the Marine at the counter. "Hey!" The stocky man's voice changed, went from controlled aggression to something uglier. "Hey, soldier boy, you think that uniform means something?" The young Marine turned slowly on his stool. He kept his hands visible. He didn't reach for anything. His jaw was set, and his eyes were steady, and Claire thought, "Good, he's trained. He knows what he's doing. Just stay still. Just stay calm. Let them take the wallets and the phones and leave." "I asked you a question." The stocky man took 2 steps toward the counter. His weapon came up. "You think you're special? You think I won't do it right here?" "I'm not looking for trouble." The Marine's voice was quiet, controlled. "Take what you want. I'm not going to stop you." "You think I need your permission?" The man's voice rose sharply. "You think I need your permission for anything?" His finger tightened on the trigger. Claire was already moving. She didn't decide. There was no decision. There was just her body doing what it had been trained to do across 4 years and 2 wars and more situations than she had names for anymore. 1 second she was in the booth. The next she was across the diner, her bad legs screaming, her entire body angled like a missile. "Down!" The word came out of somewhere deep. The same place commands came from when the artillery was close, and you didn't have time to explain yourself. She hit the Marine like a linebacker, drove him off the stool and down behind the counter just as the gun went off. The bullet punched through the space where his head had been and embedded itself in the wall. Claire hit the tile hard. The impact drove the air out of her body. The Marine landed beneath her, gasping, his dress uniform crumpling. She was already rolling, putting the bulk of the counter between them and the shooter, her hand grabbing the Marine's collar, pulling him with her. "Stay down," she breathed. "Don't move. Don't speak." His eyes were wide and white at the edges, but he nodded. Smart. "What the hell?" The tall one spun toward the counter. His weapon swung in a wide arc. "What the hell just happened?" The twitchy kid was falling apart. "We gotta go, Marcus. We gotta go right now. Somebody called the cops. I know somebody called the cops." "Shut your mouth." The tall one, Marcus, backhanded the kid without looking at him. His eyes were on the counter, on whatever was behind it. "Come out from behind there. Now." Claire pressed her palm against her leg and felt warmth. She looked down, blood spreading through her scrub pants, dark and fast. Not from the bullet itself, from something that had come off the wall or the tile. A shard, a ricochet fragment. She'd sort out the details later. Right now, the only thing that mattered was the sound of sirens, distant but getting closer, threading through the morning air like a needle. Marcus heard it too. She could tell by the way his voice changed. The command left it. The calculation entered. "Grab what you can. Move now." The stocky one fired again. Not at anyone, just rage, just covering movement, just making noise. The bullet went through a window. Glass exploded inward. More screaming. Then boots on tile. Fast. The bell above the door. The sound of tires on gravel, spinning hard. And then nothing. Just the ringing in everyone's ears, and the distant wall of sirens getting closer, and Carol crying somewhere near the kitchen, and the Marine's voice saying, low and shaking, "You're hit. You're bleeding." "I'm fine," Claire said automatically. "You are absolutely not fine. Stay down until the sirens are right outside." Her voice came out flat and precise, and she couldn't help that. It was the only voice she had left in moments like these. "Don't stand up until I tell you." She held on until the first cruiser pulled into the gravel lot. Then she let her shoulders drop about half an inch. The Marine was staring at her, really staring, the kind of stare that was trying to figure out what category to put her in. "You saved my life," he said. "Sit tight." She looked at her leg. The blood wasn't slowing. "What's your name?" "Reeves. Danny Reeves. Corporal, 1st Battalion, 7th Marines." He paused. "Who are you?" "Claire Maddox." She pressed harder against the wound. "I'm a nurse." Danny Reeves said nothing for a moment, then very quietly, "No offense, ma'am, but nurses don't move like that." Claire didn't answer. The door burst open and the paramedics flooded in, and she let herself be found. She woke in a recovery room at Harlan County Medical Center, which was the hospital where she worked, which felt like the universe's idea of a joke. The ceiling was the same one she'd stared at during the 6-month orientation after she moved here 3 years ago. The smell was the same. The fluorescent light was the same specific shade of institutional indifference. The nurse who came in to check her monitors was Patrice, a woman Claire had worked beside for 2 years without ever telling her a single true thing about herself. "You're all over the news," Patrice said. "I don't want to be." "Honey." Patrice gave her the look people give when they're about to tell you something you can't unhear. Someone had their phone out. They got the whole thing. You launching yourself across that diner. The sound you made when you hit the floor. She paused. "It's got 12 million views." Claire closed her eyes. 12 million as of an hour ago, Patrice added, in case that was the helpful part. The detective came first. A man named Briggs with kind eyes and a notebook, and the particular patience of someone who had learned that pushing people in hospital beds didn't work. He asked his questions, and Claire answered them and gave him nothing extra. Yes, she'd been at the diner. Yes, she'd seen Corporal Reeves was in danger. Yes, she'd acted on instinct. "Your instincts are pretty refined," Briggs said carefully. "I've been a nurse for 3 years. Briggs wrote something down. "The way you moved in that footage, the command you gave, that's not nursing school." He looked at her over the notebook. "That's something else." Claire stared at the ceiling. "I've been doing this job long enough to know training when I see it," Briggs said. "Military, I'd guess. But that's your business. Right now, my business is finding 3 armed men who opened fire in a civilian restaurant." He stood and tucked the notebook away. "Thank you for Corporal Reeves's life, Miss Maddox. Whatever else is true about you, you did something extraordinary today." After he left, she counted the ceiling tiles. 47. She'd counted them before, years ago in a different hospital in a different state, when she was waiting to find out how many of her people were going to come home. Warren Holt came at 2 in the afternoon. She'd been expecting someone from administration. She hadn't been expecting the chief operating officer himself, in a suit that probably cost more than her monthly rent, carrying a leather briefcase and an expression of practiced concern. Holt was 58, silver-haired, the kind of man who had learned early that a certain kind of smile made people lower their guard. He pulled up the chair beside her bed without being invited, and set the briefcase on his knee and opened it with 2 precise clicks. "Claire," his voice was warm, "I wanted to come personally. This has been an ordeal, and the hospital is deeply concerned about your well-being." "I'm fine." "Of course you are. You're remarkable," he smiled. "Which is exactly why I wanted to speak with you before the media attention gets any more intense." He pulled a folder from the briefcase and set it on the rolling tray beside her bed. "The board has authorized a paid leave. 3 months, possibly 6. Full salary. Time to heal properly." Claire looked at the folder. "I'll be back in 2 weeks. We think a longer recovery would be more appropriate given the circumstances." His tone shifted just slightly. Still smooth, still professional, but something harder underneath now. "The incident has created some liability concerns. A staff member involved in a violent confrontation. A discharged firearm in a public space. The optics aren't ideal." "I didn't discharge a firearm. 3 men with guns walked into a restaurant, and I kept one of them from shooting a Marine in the head. And that was heroic, truly." Holt opened the folder. which is why we want to protect you. This agreement provides 6 months of paid leave, full benefits continuation, and a written commitment to discuss your future role here when you return. Sign it today, and this whole situation stays contained. Claire looked at the folder for a long moment. What's in the fine print? Holt's smile held. Standard language, mutual non-disparagement, an agreement to decline media interviews during the leave period. Nothing unusual. So I take the money and I stop talking. We're trying to help you. No. Claire met his eyes and didn't look away. You're trying to help the hospital. Those aren't the same thing. Holt's smile lost about 10% of its warmth. Claire, I want to be direct with you. You're a per diem employee, no contract, no union. The hospital has complete discretion over your schedule and your continued employment. He let that land. Let the silence do the work. I would hate for this situation to become more complicated than it needs to be. Are you threatening to fire me for saving a Marine's life? I'm explaining the situation. Get out, Claire said. Holt blinked. Get out of my room. Her voice didn't rise. That was something she'd learned a long time ago, that the quietest voice in the room was often the most frightening one. I'm not signing anything, and if you try to fire me, I'll make sure every reporter who's currently calling me a hero knows exactly what this hospital does to its staff when the cameras show up. She held his gaze. I've been in situations a lot worse than you, Mr. Holt. I don't rattle easy. Holt stood slowly. Something moved behind his eyes that wasn't quite anger and wasn't quite fear, but lived in the neighborhood of both. He picked up the folder in the briefcase. You're making a mistake, he said. Wouldn't be my first. He walked out. The door swung shut behind him. Danny Reeves appeared in her doorway at 4 o'clock. His dress uniform was rumpled. There was a coffee stain on his left sleeve. He had the look of a man who had been sitting in a waiting room for 7 hours, running on willpower and guilt. They said I could have 5 minutes, he said. I've been here since they brought you in. You didn't have to do that. Yes, I did. He came inside and stood at the foot of her bed. His hands were at his sides. You threw yourself in front of a bullet for me. I don't even know your name. You know my name, Claire Maddox. I mean, I didn't know you. You didn't know me. You just... He stopped, swallowed. Why? Claire looked at him, really looked. She saw the guilt in his eyes, the weight he was already carrying, the way he held himself like a man who had decided somewhere along the way that his life was worth less than other people's lives. She knew that posture intimately. Because you're 24 years old, she said, and because no one else was moving. You're a nurse. I'm a lot of things. The nurse part is recent. He understood. She could see the moment it landed. His expression shifted, the confusion clearing into something heavier and more knowing. You served. She didn't answer, didn't need to. Danny sat down in the chair beside her bed. He looked at his hands for a moment. I called my unit, told them what happened. He shook his head with something between a laugh and a wince. My CO is losing her mind. She wants to know who you are. I'm nobody. That's not what the 12 million people who watched you launch yourself across a diner think. Claire's phone was on the nightstand where a nurse had placed it with her other belongings. She reached for it and immediately wished she hadn't. The notifications had stopped loading individually. The screen just said a number with too many digits. She put it face down. Her voicemails were worse. She scrolled through them, half listening, deleting most without finishing them, until one made her hand go still. Miss Maddox, this is Lieutenant Colonel Diane Cross, United States Marine Corps. I received a call from one of my Marines regarding an incident this morning in Harlan County. I'd like to speak with you at your earliest convenience. A pause. Please call me back. This isn't optional. Claire stared at the phone. That's my CO, Danny said quietly. He'd heard it. She doesn't say things like, this isn't optional, unless she means it. I'm a civilian. You were a civilian at that diner too. His voice was gentle. Didn't stop you from making military decisions. She set the phone down and was about to say something. She wasn't sure what, when the door opened and Dr. Marcus Webb came in. Webb ran the ER with the brisk efficiency of a man who had seen too much to be surprised by anything. He looked at Danny, looked at Claire, looked at Claire's chart. "You're healing fine," he said. "The laceration was clean, no arterial damage. 2 weeks minimum before you're back on shift." He glanced up. "There's something else. I know about the video." "Not the video." He pulled up something on his tablet and turned it toward her. "When we cleaned the wound, the surgeons found anomalies, scarring, old shrapnel fragments that weren't from today." He lowered the tablet. His voice was careful. "Those injuries are consistent with high-velocity combat trauma. I've seen them before in veterans who come through here." He held her gaze. "I'm not asking you to explain, but I needed you to know it's in your medical file now. Given the media attention, there will be questions." The room was quiet. Danny wasn't looking at her anymore. He was looking at the window. "You really did have a life before this," he said, very quietly. The hospital shifted into evening mode. The hallways quieted. Patrice came back to check vitals and told Claire that there were reporters camped in the parking lot and that someone had sent flowers to the nurses' station addressed to the brave woman in room 214, and that there were currently 4 news vans visible from the second-floor window. "I don't want visitors," Claire said. "Honey, you've got a Marine corporal who has personally thanked every single member of the nursing staff for taking care of you. He's been here 9 hours. He brought cookies." Despite everything, despite the pain and the exhaustion and the mounting dread of what tomorrow was going to look like, something in Claire's chest did something unexpected. It didn't quite soften, but it moved. "The cookies were good," Patrice added. "Chocolate chip, still warm." After she left, Claire lay in the dark and stared at the ceiling and counted tiles and told herself she had this under control. She had gotten out of harder situations than a viral video and a hospital administrator with a briefcase. She had survived things that made this look like a minor inconvenience. 47 tiles, same as always, predictable and fixed and completely indifferent to whatever was happening in the room beneath them. Her phone buzzed. She turned it over. A text from a number she didn't recognize. But the name it came up under made her stop breathing for exactly 2 seconds. Rashida Banks. She hadn't talked to Rashida in 3 years, hadn't talked to anyone from her unit in 3 years, hadn't filed for benefits, hadn't attended reunions, hadn't returned the calls that came in the first few months after she left, and then gradually stopped coming. She had moved to Harlan, West Virginia, gotten her nursing license, found a shift at the smallest hospital in a county that didn't ask too many questions, and she had made herself invisible. 3 years. And now Rashida Banks was texting her. The message was short. "Claire, I saw the video. All of it. I know where you are now. And before you delete this, you should know something first." Then, "Tyler Holt was one of the shooters." Claire read that twice. Then she sat up in bed despite the stab of pain in her leg and read it a third time. Tyler Holt. She pulled up the browser on her phone and typed the name. The results loaded slowly on the hospital Wi-Fi. She scrolled through them. Tyler Holt, age 22, Harlan County, 2 prior arrests, 1 for possession, 1 for assault. And there, in a 3-year-old social media post about a charity golf tournament, a photo. Warren Holt in a perfect navy blazer, arm around a thin-faced kid with nervous eyes. "My nephew Tyler," the caption read. "Proud of this young man every day." Claire sat with that information for a long time. Warren Holt had walked into her hospital room 6 hours ago with a settlement agreement and a barely concealed threat. He'd moved fast, moved hard, moved like a man trying to get ahead of something before it caught up to him. She'd thought it was about liability, about the hospital's image, about a COO protecting his institution. But it wasn't about the institution. It was about Tyler. Rashida's next text came in while Claire was still processing the first one. "I'm not the only one who knows. I've been talking to someone. a reporter named Maya Osei. She's been investigating a string of armed robberies in this county for 6 months. Same crew, same pattern. 3 men, rural locations, small businesses. Claire, Warren Holt has been paying Tyler's debts for months. Legal fees, rehab bills, collection agencies. And then 2 months ago, all of it stopped. Paid off overnight. Cash. Claire's hands were very still on the phone. Rashida's final text landed like a stone into standing water. He didn't come to your room to protect the hospital. He came because he knew if this investigation went far enough, someone was going to find his nephew's face on a security camera. And he needed you quiet before that happened. The ceiling tiles were still 47. The monitors still beeped. The hospital still smelled like antiseptic and recycled air. But the room felt completely different. Warren Holt hadn't tried to buy her silence because she was a liability. He'd tried to buy her silence because she was the only witness who had looked directly at his nephew's face in that diner. And somewhere in the back of his mind, he was terrified she recognized him. Claire reached for her phone and called Rashida back. She answered on the first ring. "I know," Claire said. "I figured you'd figure it out. How long have you known?" "Long enough." Rashida's voice was steady and low, and exactly like Claire remembered it. "Long enough that I've been worried about you since the second that video went live. Because if Holt knows you can identify Tyler, and I think he does, then that settlement offer wasn't the last move he was going to make." A noise in the hallway. Footsteps, then silence. "Claire," Rashida said, "you need to be careful tonight." The power in the hospital flickered, just once, just for a half second. The monitors dipped and came back, and the fluorescent light buzzed and steadied. In the hallway outside her door, the footsteps had stopped. Claire looked at the door for a long moment. Then she reached over and pressed the call button for the nurse's station. No one answered. Warren Holt had tried to buy her silence, and she had told him to get out of her room. And somewhere in this building, a man who had every reason to want her quiet had just found out that hadn't worked. She reached for the only thing on the nightstand that could pass for a weapon, a metal water pitcher, heavy and solid, and she held it in her right hand, and she did not take her eyes off the door. Some fights you see coming, some fights come to you. Claire Maddox had spent 3 years pretending she was done with both kinds. She was done pretending. The door didn't open, not that minute, not the next. Claire sat with the metal pitcher in her hand and her eyes on the door, and her breathing slow and controlled, the way she'd learned to keep it when everything inside her wanted to do the opposite. And after 4 minutes of nothing, she allowed herself to set the pitcher down. Not far, just on the tray where she could reach it in under a second. The call button still hadn't been answered. She was about to press it again when the door swung inward and Danny Reeves stepped through, looking like a man who had just run up 2 flights of stairs. "The nurse's station on this floor is empty," he said. "Both of them. I walked the whole hallway." His eyes dropped to the pitcher in her reach. He didn't comment on it. "Your door was the only one with the call light on." "How long have you been in the building?" "I never left." He pulled the chair close to the bed and sat down. "I was in the family waiting area down the hall when the lights flickered. Something felt wrong." Claire picked up her phone and called Rashida back. It went to voicemail. She tried twice more. Nothing. She stared at the screen for a moment, then pulled up the text thread and typed, "Call me now. Something's off." No raid receipt, no response. "Okay," she said, not to Danny, to herself. She was running the variables. Holt knew she'd refused to sign. Rashida knew about Tyler. Maya Osei, whoever she was, had been investigating for 6 months. That was a lot of loose threads for a man who had spent the last 6 hours trying to tie everything off. "What aren't you telling me?" Danny said. She looked at him, made a decision in about half a second. "One of the men from the diner, the young one, the nervous one, his name is Tyler Holt, Warren Holt's nephew." Danny was very still. Holt didn't come here to protect the hospital's image. He came here because if this investigation goes deep enough, someone's going to pull that kid's face off a security camera and trace it back to him. She watched Danny process it. He's been paying Tyler's debts, covering for him, and now he needs me quiet before the FBI connects the dots. Danny's jaw tightened. That's why he moves so fast. That's why he moves so fast. Does anyone else know? A reporter in my... She stopped, reached for a word. Someone I used to serve with. Danny opened his mouth to respond, and then both of them heard it. Not footsteps this time. Something lower. A door, somewhere in the building, closing with the specific quiet of someone trying not to be heard. Claire's hand found the picture again without her telling it to. Then the hallway flooded with voices. Multiple people, fast and professional, and the door opened hard. A woman in Marine Corps dress uniform walked in like she owned the building. 47 years old maybe. Dark skin, silver hair clipped tight, eyes that stripped everything they landed on down to its essential function. She stopped 2 feet inside the door and looked at Claire the way experienced people look at the aftermath of a situation they were told about but needed to see for themselves. Behind her, 2 more Marines in uniform stopped in the doorway. "Ms. Maddox," the woman said, "I'm Lieutenant Colonel Diane Cross. We spoke on the phone earlier, or rather I left you a voicemail and you deleted it." "I didn't delete it. You didn't call back. I was busy almost getting threatened in my hospital room." Cross looked at Danny. Danny came to attention instinctively. "At ease, Corporal." She looked back at Claire. "I need 5 minutes." "You've already used 2. Cross pulled the chair away from the bed and turned it around and sat down with her forearms on the back of it like she was settling in for something that was going to take longer than 5 minutes, regardless of what either of them wanted. Her 2 Marines stayed in the doorway. "Staff Sergeant Claire Maddox," Cross said, "former 2nd Battalion, 75th Ranger Regiment. 4 deployments, Iraq twice, Syria twice. Bronze Star with Valor, Purple Heart, and Firebase Kilo." She paused on those last 2 words the way people paused on them when they knew what they meant. "You were medically separated 14 months after that action. PTSD diagnosis. Recommended for outpatient psychiatric support through the VA." She tilted her head slightly. "Which you never accessed." "I had a plan. Disappearing to West Virginia was the plan. It worked for 3 years. It stopped working this morning at 6:52 a.m. when 3 armed men walked into a diner." Cross held her gaze. "I'm not here to relitigate your choices. I'm here because one of my Marines is alive because of you, and because the story that's spreading about who you are and what you did is going to get a lot bigger before it gets smaller, and you need someone in your corner before it does." Claire looked at her for a long moment. "What do you actually know about Firebase Kilo?" "I know the official record. 6 Marines killed during a coordinated assault. Senior medic made the call to evacuate the wounded rather than reinforce the perimeter. 14 men came home alive who wouldn't have otherwise. The review board cleared you and recommended commendation." Cross didn't move. "I also know that the official record and the thing you carry aren't the same document." The room was quiet except for the sound of the monitors. 6 men, Claire said. They stayed behind to cover the evac. They knew what it meant. I knew what it meant. Her voice was level. Not because she didn't feel it, because she'd had 3 years of practice keeping the feelings separate from the words. "And I've been a nurse in a county hospital ever since, because it was the only thing I could think of that used the skills without making me into what I was before." "What were you before?" "Someone who made decisions that got people killed. Someone who made decisions that saved 14 lives. Cross leaned forward slightly. "There's a difference, Maddox. You just haven't been willing to see it yet." Danny had moved to the window. He was looking out at the parking lot in the news vans and the dark that had settled over Harlan County while they'd all been inside this room. When he spoke, his voice was carefully neutral, in the way young men's voices got when they were trying not to show how hard something was hitting them. "There are people down there holding signs," he said. "I can see them from here. Two groups. One of them," he paused. "One of them has signs with your face on them, ma'am. The other group," he stopped again. "What does the other group's signs say?" "Things I'm not going to repeat in this room." Cross stood and moved to the window and looked down. Her expression didn't change, but something behind her eyes did. She turned back to Claire. "This is going to get uglier before it stabilizes. Holt has already spoken to 3 local media outlets. He's calling your actions reckless, questioning whether a staff member with your background should be permitted in a clinical environment." She said it flat and factual, the way you delivered intelligence that needed to be processed, not reacted to. "He's moving fast. He's scared. Scared men are dangerous men." "I know." Claire pushed herself to sitting, ignoring the pull in her leg. "What I don't know is why you're here at 9 o'clock at night instead of tomorrow morning. You didn't drive from wherever you're based to give me a pep talk." Cross looked at her steadily. "No, I didn't." She reached into her jacket and produced a folded document, set it on the rolling tray. "FBI field office out of Charleston made contact with my office 4 hours ago. They've been running an investigation into a series of armed robberies across 6 counties. Tonight they identified one of the suspects from the diner footage." She tapped the document. "Tyler Holt, Warren Holt's nephew. But the FBI isn't interested in Tyler." She let that settle. "They're interested in who's been funding his operation. And the money trail doesn't stop at Warren Holt." Claire went very still. "Holt's been funneling cash to Tyler for 6 months. That's confirmed. But the cash coming into Holt's private accounts from sources that have nothing to do with his salary at this hospital, those originated somewhere else." Cross held her gaze. "The FBI needs a cooperating witness, someone who was present at the diner incident, someone Tyler's crew can't claim, didn't see anything." She paused. "They need you." The door opened without a knock. A woman walked in carrying a messenger bag and moving with the careful, deliberate energy of someone who had gotten good at entering rooms where she wasn't entirely welcome. Early 30s, dark-skinned, natural hair, pressed credential on a lanyard that she'd turned face down, like she already knew what Claire's reaction to it was going to be. "Maya Osei," the woman said. "I've been texting with Rashida Banks for the past 40 minutes. She sent me here." She looked at Claire directly. "I know about Tyler. I know about the money. And I know you have about 6 hours before Warren Holt does something irreversible." Danny looked at Cross. Cross looked at Claire. Claire looked at Maya Osei and tried to read her in the 30 seconds she had available and decided she was either exactly what she appeared to be or she was the most convincing performance she'd encountered outside of a combat zone. "Show me what you have," Claire said. Maya opened the messenger bag and pulled out a tablet and a folder and set them on the bed within Claire's reach. The tablet showed a spreadsheet, account numbers, transfer dates, amounts. The folder held printouts, bank records, property filings, and at the bottom, a photograph. A man in his mid-60s, silver-haired, standing beside Warren Holt at what looked like a fundraising dinner, both of them smiling the kind of smile that required practice. "Senator James Calloway," Maya said. "Virginia State Senate, 12 years. He sits on the Oversight Committee for State Law Enforcement Funding, which means he has access to investigation files and informant identities." She turned the tablet toward Claire. "The money going into Holt's accounts comes from 3 shell companies. All 3 were registered by the same attorney. That attorney has represented Calloway's business interests for 9 years. The room was extremely quiet. "You're telling me a state senator is funding an armed robbery ring through a hospital administrator," Cross said. "I'm telling you the money goes there. What it's funding is a pattern of cash-intensive small business robberies across 6 counties that generate clean money that then moves through legitimate channels." Maya's voice was steady and practiced. the voice of someone who had rehearsed this explanation to editors and skeptical sources and people who needed convincing. The robberies aren't the point. The robberies are the mechanism. How long have you known? Claire asked. I've been building this for 6 months. I had the pattern. I had the financial trail. What I didn't have was a face. Maya looked at her. Tyler Holt gave me the face. The diner gave me the story. She paused. And Warren Holt's attempt to silence you gave me the motive. Claire picked up the photograph of Calloway and Holt. They were comfortable with each other. Not the stiff comfort of professional acquaintance. The easy comfort of men who had done things together that couldn't be put in writing. Rashida, Claire said. Where is she? She was on her way here an hour ago. She stopped responding to my texts about 40 minutes back. Maya's composure held, but her eyes moved to the door and back. I've been trying not to think about what that means. Danny moved. He went to the door, opened it, looked both ways and came back. The 2 Marines in the hallway are gone, he said. Cross was already on her radio. What happened in the next 90 seconds happened fast. Cross reached someone on the radio and got back 3 words. Situation developing, lobby, and then her 2 Marines came back through the door at a controlled run and said something in her ear that made her eyes go flat and professional in the way eyes did when something you'd been managing as a possibility just became a fact. There are men in the parking garage, Cross said, not press, not protesters. My people made them as armed about 4 minutes ago and called it in and then lost them when the service elevator went offline. She looked at Claire. Someone cut power to the East Wing cameras 60 seconds ago. Maya was on her phone. Rashida just texted. She's in the building. East stairwell. She says there are 2 men between her and the main corridor. Claire was already pulling the IV from her arm. You cannot walk on that leg, Cross said. I can walk on this leg fine. You have 12 stitches and a moderate blood loss event from 8 hours ago. Then I'll walk fast. Claire's feet hit the floor, and the pain announced itself like a door slamming open, and she breathed through it and stood. Danny had her crutch before she could reach for it. She took it, planted it, looked at Cross. Rashida Banks saved my life in Syria in 2019. She is not spending tonight in a stairwell because I stayed in bed. Cross held her gaze for exactly 2 seconds. Then she turned to her Marines. Formation, Ms. Maddox in the center. We move in 60 seconds. She looked at Maya. You're in the middle. You do not stop moving for any reason. If we get separated, you find a locked room with a landline, and you call 911, and you stay there until I personally come to get you. Maya nodded once, tight. And you, Cross said to Danny, I'm not leaving her. I know you're not. That's why I was going to put you on her left side. Cross pulled her sidearm. Let's go. The hallway was wrong in the way that empty spaces go wrong at night when they shouldn't be empty. The nurse's station was unmanned again. The corridor lights at the far end were down to emergency backup. Claire moved on the crutch, steady and quick. Cross 2 steps ahead. Danny at her left. Maya directly behind. They were halfway to the east stairwell when the fire alarm went off. The sound was immediate and total, filling the building wall to wall. Somewhere above them, doors started opening. Voices. The controlled confusion of a building full of people responding to a protocol none of them had expected to need tonight. Diversion, Claire said. Confirmed. Cross didn't slow down. Classic. Flush the building, move the target in the crowd. They know which room I was in. They knew which room you were in 20 minutes ago. They don't know where you are now. Cross turned a corner and stopped at a door that wasn't marked and pressed her key card against a reader, and it clicked open. A service corridor, institutional lighting, the smell of old concrete and cleaning supplies. Maintenance access goes to the east stairwell without touching the public hallways. Rashida was on the second landing. She was pressed against the wall, breathing hard, a 4-inch gash above her left ear that was bleeding freely down the side of her face and not slowing the way it should. In her right hand, she had a compact folding knife, open, held low, the way Claire had taught her to hold it, in a different country, in a different life that had apparently not stayed as far in the past as either of them had planned. Claire reached her first. Rashida looked up and something in her face came apart for exactly 1 second. The pure, involuntary relief of seeing someone you'd been terrified you weren't going to see. And then it put itself back together and she was steady again. There were 2 of them, Rashida said. East parking entrance. They weren't expecting me. I used the seconds I had. She touched the gash on her head without flinching. I need 3 stitches, maybe 4. I'll put them in myself. I know you will. Rashida looked past Claire to Cross, who was scanning the stairwell above and below with her weapon up, and then to Danny, and then to Maya. You got my message. All of it, Claire said. Callaway, the shell companies, the whole chain. Rashida's jaw set. Then you know this isn't over when Holt gets arrested. This goes deeper than Holt. Her eyes met Claire's. The 2 men at the door tonight, they weren't amateurs. They were trained, organized, and they had the hospital's internal camera layout on a phone screen. Someone gave that to them. Someone with access. The alarm kept screaming above them. Cross lowered her weapon and looked at Claire with the expression of a woman who had been in difficult situations long enough to know when one had just gotten significantly more complicated. The FBI field office needs to know about this tonight, she said. All of it. Callaway, the camera access, the attack on Banks. This just became a federal assault on a potential witness in an active investigation. She held Claire's gaze. Which means you're not a nurse who had a bad morning at a diner anymore. Claire looked at Rashida's bleeding head and Maya's white-knuckled grip on her bag and Danny standing at her shoulder like a wall that had decided to become a person. 3 years. She'd spent 3 years making herself small and quiet and invisible and believing that was the same thing as safe. She understood now, standing in a concrete stairwell while a building full of people she worked with evacuated around her, that she had been wrong about that in a way she didn't have any more time to be wrong about. Then let's stop wasting time, she said, and started moving toward the bottom of the stairs. They came out of the stairwell into the ground floor maintenance corridor, and Cross held up a fist, and everyone stopped. Voices ahead, 2 of them, male, low and deliberate, the kind of voices that weren't looking for help, weren't lost, weren't responding to the fire alarm the way everyone else in the building was. Claire heard them through the door at the end of the corridor and felt her body do what it always did. Go quiet, go cold, go absolutely focused in a way that had nothing to do with decision and everything to do with years. Cross turned and held up 2 fingers. Claire nodded. Danny shifted his weight forward onto the balls of his feet. Rashida folded the knife closed and put it in her pocket and picked up a length of metal pipe from the floor that had no business being there and held it like someone who had held things like that before. Maya pressed herself against the wall and didn't make a sound, which in Claire's estimation was the most useful thing she could have done. Cross went through the door first. What happened on the other side took 11 seconds. Claire heard it more than saw it. 2 impacts, one voice cutting off hard, the sound of something heavy meeting concrete floor. Then Cross's voice, flat and controlled. Clear, move. They moved. The 2 men on the floor were zip-tied at the wrists before Claire had fully processed their faces. Both armed, both wearing the specific blank expression of men who had been hired to do something and hadn't been told the something would involve a Marine lieutenant colonel who moved like she'd been built in a factory that made nothing else. These aren't Tyler's people, Rashida said, looking down at them. Different gear, different discipline. No, Claire agreed. These are somebody else's. Cross was already on her radio again, low and fast, calling in positions, requesting backup, giving the kind of precise coordinates that came from memorizing building layouts before you entered them. She was the kind of officer who walked into rooms already knowing how to leave them, and Claire found herself grateful for that in a way that had nothing complicated in it. We need to get to a vehicle, Cross said. My people have 2 outside on the north perimeter, but the parking garage is between us and them. There's a pedestrian exit on the east side, Danny said, bypasses the garage entirely, comes out on Ridgeline Road. Everyone looked at him. I grew up in Harlan, he said simply. The east exit door was alarmed, but the alarm was already going, had been going for 4 minutes, and one more trigger point added nothing to the noise. They came out into cold October air and the distant sound of fire trucks that had been called for a fire that didn't exist. And Cross's 2 Marines materialized out of the dark, like they'd been standing there waiting since the beginning of time. The vehicle was a black government SUV, engine running, parked on Ridgeline Road with its lights off. They loaded fast. Claire in the back with Rashida, Danny up front beside the driver, Maya between Cross's Marines in the middle row, Cross herself in the front passenger seat, already on the phone before the door closed. Harlan County Medical is compromised, she said into the phone. No preamble, no pleasantries. I have the witness. I need a secure location and an FBI liaison, Charleston Field Office, within the hour. She listened. I know what time it is. She listened again. Then wake him up. The SUV moved north on Ridgeline Road, and the hospital disappeared behind them, and Claire allowed herself exactly 30 seconds of something that felt like relief before she looked at Rashida's head and the dried blood tracking down the side of her face, and remembered that relief was a thing you got to have after, not during. Let me see that, she said. Rashida tilted her head. Claire examined the wound with her fingers, gentle and professional. The same hands that had done this in emergency rooms and forward operating bases, and the back of vehicles moving too fast over bad roads. Hands that knew the difference between a cut that waited and a cut that didn't. 4 stitches, she said. I need a kit. Cross reached into the back without turning around and produced a field medical kit from somewhere behind the seat. Claire looked at it and then at Cross. You came prepared, she said. I came prepared for you, Cross said. I read your service record before I drove here. Rashida sat still while Claire worked and talked at the same time, because that was what they both knew how to do. Keep the hands busy while the mouth handled something harder. The 2 men at the stairwell door, Rashida said, they knew your room number. They knew the camera layout. Someone inside that building fed that information out. She didn't flinch when the needle went in. I think it was Holt himself. He has admin access to the hospital's security system. He had my room number before he visited me this afternoon, Claire said. He would have had access to the camera grid on his phone. So when you threw him out, he made a call. He made a call. Maya had her tablet out. The 2 shell companies connected to Calloway's attorney. I traced one of them this afternoon before I came to the hospital. It's registered to a holding company in Delaware. The holding company has 1 board member. She turned the tablet toward Claire, though Claire's hands were occupied and she couldn't look. A former Virginia State Police superintendent named Gerald Voss. He retired 4 years ago. He now runs private security consulting, high-end clients. She paused. The men at the hospital weren't amateurs, and they weren't Tyler Holt's crew. They were Voss's. Calloway hired a private security firm to clean up his mess, Cross said from the front seat. It wasn't a question. I think he's been using them for years, Maya said. Any time a thread got too close to pulling. The SUV turned onto a county road, and the streetlights thinned out, and the dark got deeper, and nobody spoke for a moment. The fire truck's sirens faded behind them. Claire tied off the last stitch on Rashida's head and cut the thread and pressed a clean square of gauze against it and taped it down. You're going to have a scar, she said. I already have scars. Rashida turned and looked at her directly. Claire, what are we walking into? Claire held her gaze. She'd known Rashida Banks for 9 years, had served alongside her for 4 of them, had made promises in forward operating bases and field hospitals that she'd mostly kept, and one that she hadn't, and that one had weighed more than all the others combined. Rashida knew her well enough to know when she was processing and when she was ready, and to wait for the difference. Calloway's scared, Claire said. He lost his operational manager in Tyler's crew. He's got the FBI sniffing at Holt's finances, and now a witness who can put a face to the diner robbery and connect it to his money trail is alive and talking and refused to be bought. She looked at Danny. He's not done making moves. Then neither are we, Danny said. The secure location Cross had arranged was a conference room in the basement of the Harlan County Sheriff's Department, which was either very safe or not safe at all, depending on who inside it Calloway had access to. And Cross seemed aware of that because she walked in first and had a quiet conversation with the sheriff himself that ended with the sheriff looking like a man who had just been informed that something much larger than his county had moved through it while he was looking the other way. The FBI liaison arrived at 11:47. Special Agent Donna Hartwell, Charleston Field Office, mid-40s, efficient in the way people got when they'd been woken up and were directing the irritation into focus. She shook Cross's hand, looked at Claire's hospital clothes and sutured leg, and Rashida's bandaged head, and made the calculation that experienced agents made when they arrived at a scene that had already been through several rounds. "You've had a full day," she said to Claire. "You could say that. I need everything. Start at the diner and don't leave anything out." Claire talked for 40 minutes. She gave Hartwell the diner. She gave her Holt and the settlement offer. She gave her Rashida's information about Tyler and the money. She gave her Maya's research on the shell companies and Voss. She gave her the two men in the maintenance corridor and the camera access and the specific trained quality of the people who had come for her tonight. That meant they weren't Tyler Holt's desperate relatives. She gave her all of it in order, clearly, without editorializing, the way she'd been trained to give after-action reports in situations where every detail mattered and nothing could be reconstructed later. Hartwell took notes and asked precise questions, and when Claire finished, she sat back and looked at Cross and said, "You understand what you're describing." "I understand what she's describing," Cross said. "A sitting state senator is running a money laundering operation through an armed robbery network and has now ordered at least one witness intimidation attempt involving hired operatives." Hartwell's voice was very flat. "I need to make some calls." "While you make them," Maya said, "I need to know whether I can publish what I have." Hartwell looked at her. "Not yet." "How long is not yet?" "Until I tell you otherwise." Hartwell's eyes were steady. "If you publish before we move on Calloway, he goes to ground and takes everything with him. 6 months of investigation disappears. Every person he's paid to keep quiet stays quiet. Can you hold it?" Maya looked at Claire. Claire looked back at her. "Your call." 24 hours, Maya said. "Then I publish with or without clearance." Hartwell nodded once. 24 hours. The room cleared out incrementally. Cross took her Marines to coordinate something with the sheriff. Hartwell stepped into the hallway with her phone. Danny had gone to find coffee, which was the most useful thing anyone could do at midnight in a county sheriff's building, and he'd taken Maya with him because she was running on fumes and needed something to do with her hands. That left Claire and Rashida alone at the conference table for the first time since Rashida had walked back into her life through a stairwell door with blood on her face. Rashida put her elbows on the table. "Firebase Kilo." Claire looked at the wall. "I knew that was coming." "Hartwell's going to ask you about it. Calloway's people will use it when this goes to court. You need to decide what you're going to say before someone else decides it for you." "I know what I did." "I know you do. I was there." Rashida's voice was quiet and direct, the same voice she'd used in the worst hours of the worst places. The voice that meant she was done being gentle about something because being gentle wasn't helping anymore. "You made a call that saved 14 lives. You also made a call that 6 people didn't come home from. And you've been carrying the second part of that like it cancels the first. Doesn't it?" "No." Rashida said it without hesitation. "Claire, the firebase was going to fall. Intel had confirmed it before the assault even started. We were outnumbered and the perimeter was already breached. You didn't cost those 6 Marines their lives. The situation did. What you did was make sure it wasn't 20. Claire looked at her hands. The stitches in her leg were pulling, and the exhaustion was deep in her bones now. The kind that came not from physical depletion, but from being completely exposed for too many hours in a row. She had spent 3 years in Harlan County being nobody, and in 17 hours, she had become the kind of person that hired operatives were sent to silence. And there was no version of the next week that had her going back to being nobody. I told them to stay, she said. The 6, I said, hold the north perimeter while we got the wounded out. I looked Sergeant Adkins in the eyes and I said, hold it. And I walked away with the stretcher teams, and I heard the firefight start behind me, and I kept walking because that was the job. Her voice didn't break. She'd said this to herself so many times in 3 years that the breaking had happened long ago, and what was left was something harder. I heard it start, and I kept walking. Because 20 men needed you to keep walking. They needed me to keep walking, Claire said. Adkins and 5 other men needed me to come back for them. There was nothing to come back to. Rashida's voice was very quiet. I need you to hear me say that. There was nothing to come back to by the time the wounded were in the evac zone. You know that. You've always known that. The thing you haven't been able to let yourself know is that knowing it doesn't make you a bad person. The door opened and Danny came back with coffee and read the room accurately enough to set the cups down without speaking and take a seat at the far end of the table and give them the silence they were still in the middle of. Hartwell came back at 12:30 with a different energy, controlled and purposeful, the kind that meant things had been set in motion that couldn't be stopped. Calloway's people identified Tyler Holt as a material risk 3 hours ago, she said. We picked up a communication intercept. Someone inside the investigation flagged Tyler as a potential cooperating witness to an outside party. She set a printed document on the table. Tyler's last known location was his uncle's property in Letcher County. We sent a unit. He was gone. But there was a vehicle registered to a holding company connected to Voss in the driveway. The room was very still. They went to get him, Cross said. They went to get him, Hartwell confirmed. Claire looked at the document. Tyler was 19 when he started running with Marcus's crew. His uncle paid his debts, gave him a place to stay. He was never the muscle. He was the liability, the nervous kid who could be flipped if someone got to him first. She looked at Hartwell. They're not going to bring him somewhere quiet and have a conversation. No, Hartwell said. They're not. How long ago did that vehicle show up at Holt's property? Approximately 2 hours. Rashida was already standing. Where is he? Do you have a location? We have a cell signal, intermittent, from a phone registered to Tyler Holt. It's been pinging a tower 6 miles east of here. Hartwell looked at Cross. I have 2 field agents moving on it, but if Voss's people are ahead of us. They are ahead of you, Claire said. They've been ahead of everything tonight. She stood, ignoring the protest from her leg. I need to be there. You are a civilian witness recovering from a surgical wound. I'm a former Army Ranger medic who has been in harder situations than a county road in October. She held Hartwell's gaze. If Tyler is alive when your agents get there, he's going to need medical attention before he needs anything else. And if he's going to talk to anyone, it's not going to be strangers. She pulled on the jacket someone had found for her at the sheriff's office, stiff and too large. He saw my face in that diner. He knows I'm the reason he's in this. Sometimes that's the thing that makes someone tell the truth. Hartwell looked at Cross. Cross looked at Claire with the expression she'd been using all night, the one that meant she'd already decided, but was checking one more time to be sure. You fall behind, you stop, she said. That's not negotiable. I've never fallen behind in my life. There's a first time for everything. Not tonight, Claire said. Let's go. The road east of Harlan was dark and narrow, and the SUV moved fast with its lights on now, protocol abandoned for speed. Hartwell's 2 field agents were already on scene when they arrived, but the situation they'd found wasn't the one anyone had planned for. Tyler Holt was on the ground behind an abandoned equipment shed, hands zip-tied in front of him, a wound in his left shoulder that was bleeding faster than it should. He was conscious, barely. His face was the face Claire had seen across the diner, young and scared, but the fear had been reduced to something simpler now. The fear of a man who understood exactly where the night was heading. The man standing over him was Marcus Webb. Not Dr. Marcus Webb from the hospital, the other Marcus. The one who had been in the diner that morning with the wiry build and the professional efficiency and the voice that had known how to give orders. The operational manager. The man who had been running Tyler's crew and now was standing over the piece of that crew that had become a problem. He had a weapon. He had it aimed at Tyler's head, and he had not heard them coming because the wind was in the right direction, and Cross's Marines move without sound when they needed to. Don't. Claire's voice came out before she'd told it to, clear and flat and carrying across the cold air with a weight that stopped Marcus where he was. He turned his head, saw the weapons trained on him, calculated the math and didn't like it, but hadn't put his gun down yet. Back off, Marcus said. This doesn't involve you. You made it involve me at 6:52 this morning. She moved forward slowly, crutch on the gravel, Cross 2 steps behind her. Put the weapon down. Tyler's a liability. Marcus's voice was steady, the voice of a professional explaining something obvious. He was always going to break. This is cleanup. He's 22 years old. He's a loose thread. He's a kid whose uncle used him. Claire kept moving, slow and steady, her eyes on Marcus and not the weapon because the weapon wasn't the decision. Marcus was the decision, and she needed him looking at her. Whatever Calloway promised you for doing this tonight, it's not enough. The FBI has the financial records. They have communications intercepts. They have your vehicle registration at 3 separate crime scenes. She stopped 8 feet from him. The only version of tonight that ends with you seeing tomorrow morning is you putting that gun down right now. Marcus looked at her for a long moment. Something moved in his face. Not doubt, calculation. The same cold math she'd seen in the diner when he'd decided how far to push the situation. He put the gun down. Tyler was talking before Hartwell's agents got the zip ties off him. Talking fast and disorganized, and with the specific, desperate energy of a man who has been about to die and has reconsidered every choice he's ever made in the 2 minutes since. Calloway's name came out in the 3rd sentence. Voss's name came out in the 5th. The specific account numbers that Tyler had been given to deposit cash into came out in pieces over the next 10 minutes, while Claire worked on his shoulder and kept her voice low and steady and let him talk without interrupting. Danny crouched beside them and held the flashlight and didn't say anything, which was exactly right. My uncle told me it was temporary, Tyler said. He was shaking, partly blood loss, partly shock, partly the specific collapse that happened when the thing you'd been running from finally caught you. Told me I did a few jobs, got clear of my debts, and then I was done. But it was never done. Every time I tried to stop, Marcus showed up and told me what happened to people who tried to stop. His eyes found Claire's face. I saw you in the diner. I knew who you were. My uncle had shown me a photo, said there was a nurse at the hospital who might ask questions. Said if she ever showed up anywhere near us, I was supposed to tell Marcus immediately. He stopped, swallowed. I didn't know he meant to do this. I know, Claire said. She kept her hands moving, applying pressure, checking his pulse, doing the work. I know you didn't. I'm sorry, Tyler said. I'm so sorry. Tell Hartwell everything you just told me, Claire said. Every name, every account number, every instruction your uncle gave you. She pressed a field dressing against his shoulder and held it firm. That's how you make it right. The arrest came in sequence over the next 90 minutes. Marcus first, on the scene. Warren Holt at his home at 2 a.m, opened the door in a bathrobe to find 2 FBI agents and a county sheriff's deputy with a warrant that covered 17 counts. 3 of Voss's operatives were picked up at a roadside motel 8 miles north of Harlan. Voss himself was detained at the regional airport at 2:45, trying to clear security with a ticket that had been booked 4 hours earlier. Calloway was last, and Calloway was different, because Calloway had a security detail and a campaign office and 3 attorneys on call, and the kind of practiced political composure that meant he watched the agents enter his home and recite his rights with an expression of calm outrage that was designed to be photographed. He said nothing without counsel. He maintained everything with the steady determination of a man who believed his infrastructure was still intact. He didn't know yet that Tyler had been talking for 90 minutes. He didn't know yet that Marcus had agreed to a preliminary cooperation agreement in the back of an FBI vehicle on a county road in exchange for not being charged with attempted murder. He didn't know yet that the thread he'd been trying to cut for 6 months was now a rope, and it was wrapped around everything. Cross found Claire sitting on the rear bumper of the SUV at 3 in the morning, legs stretched out, crutch leaning against the fender, watching the county road with the empty, focused look of someone whose body had finally sent in its resignation letter. "Hartwell wants a formal statement," Cross said. "Tomorrow, whenever you're ready." "I'll be ready in the morning." Cross sat down beside her. Not something a lieutenant colonel did habitually, Claire suspected. "You know this isn't the end of it," she said. "Calloway will fight the charges. His attorneys will come after your credibility. Firebase Kilo, the PTSD diagnosis. They'll use everything." "I know, and you're still going to testify." Claire looked at the dark tree line at the edge of the road and thought about 6 men on a perimeter in a firebase that was already lost, and a decision that had cost them everything and saved everyone else. And she thought about the 3 years she'd spent carrying that decision like it was a verdict instead of a war. "Yeah," she said, "I'm going to testify." Cross was quiet for a moment. "You know what I saw tonight? I saw someone who spent 3 years trying to be invisible discover that she never actually was." She stood brushing gravel off her uniform. "The people who are coming for you in that courtroom are counting on you to be ashamed of who you are." She looked down at Claire steadily. "Don't give them that. Don't give them 1 single inch of it." Claire held her gaze. "Semper Fi," Cross said quietly. The county road was cold and dark, and 3 miles away a senator who had believed himself untouchable was sitting in the back of a federal vehicle, learning what it felt like when the world stopped agreeing with him. Claire Maddox had not been invisible for a single moment of the last 21 hours. She was just now beginning to understand what that meant. She slept 4 hours on a cot in the sheriff's department break room and woke up already knowing what the day was going to ask of her. The formal statement took 3 hours. Hartwell ran it with 2 other agents present and a court reporter, and the specific, careful thoroughness of someone building something that needed to hold weight under pressure. Claire answered every question the same way she'd given after-action reports in the field. Complete, ordered, nothing withheld, nothing softened. When she was done, her leg was stiff and her throat was dry, and Hartwell looked at her across the table with the expression of someone who had just been given exactly what they needed and knew the cost of it. "Calloway's attorneys are already filing motions," Hartwell said. "They submitted a preliminary challenge to the charges at 7 this morning. They're calling it a politically motivated prosecution." She set a document on the table. "They're also calling you." Claire looked at the document. "What am I in their version?" "An unstable veteran with an undiagnosed trauma disorder who manufactured a connection between their client and a robbery ring he had no knowledge of." Hartwell's voice was flat and informational. "They're going to argue that your account of events has been shaped by hypervigilance and combat-related misperception, that you saw a threat where there wasn't one, and pulled everyone else into your interpretation. That's going to be hard to argue, given that their client's hired security tried to kill a witness last night. They're arguing those men were acting without Calloway's knowledge or authorization." Hartwell looked at her steadily. "It won't hold. But it doesn't have to hold forever. It just has to create doubt." Danny was in the hallway when she came out. He'd gone home at 4 in the morning at Cross's insistence and come back at 7 with a change of clothes for Rashida and a paper bag of food from the only place in Harlan County open at that hour. And he was sitting in a plastic chair with his elbows on his knees and his eyes tracking her the moment the door opened. "How'd it go?" he said. "It went." She took the coffee he offered. "Calloway's people are moving fast. What do they have?" "Me." She said it without self-pity, just as a fact. "I'm the thread they need to pull. If they can make a jury believe I'm unreliable, the rest of the case gets harder. Tyler's testimony is stronger with mine behind it. Without mine, it's a scared kid trying to reduce his sentence, pointing at a senator." She drank the coffee. "That's manageable for a good defense team. That's 2 years of appeals and reasonable doubt, and Calloway walking out of a courthouse in a good suit." Danny was quiet for a moment. "Then don't let them make you unreliable." "That's the plan. I mean it literally." He looked at her with the directness of someone who had spent a night being afraid for a person and had come out the other side of it with fewer filters than he'd started with. "I watched you last night, in that stairwell, on that county road. You're the most clear-headed person I've ever been in a bad situation with. Whatever they try to say about you in that courtroom, the people in this building saw something different. People in this building aren't on the jury." "No," he said, "but I am going to testify, and so is Rashida, and so is Colonel Cross." He met her eyes. "You didn't do any of this alone, ma'am. Stop thinking about it like you did." The grand jury was convened 8 days later in a federal courthouse in Charleston. 8 days that Claire spent at Rashida's apartment in Harlan because her own place felt too exposed. 8 days of physical therapy for her leg and prep sessions with the federal prosecutor and the specific grinding anxiety of waiting for a process that moved on its own schedule, regardless of what it was costing the people inside it. The prosecutor was a woman named Helen Marsh, 51, former Army JAG, who had the kind of precision that came from spending years in rooms where imprecision got people hurt. She had read Claire's full service record and asked her questions about it in their first session, with the same flat directness that Hartwell had used. And Claire had answered them the same way. Everything included, nothing softened. And Marsh had listened and then said, "Good. Tell it exactly like that." "They're going to use Firebase Kilo," Claire said. "They're going to try." Marsh set down her pen. "Here's what they're going to find. A review board that cleared you completely. A commanding officer's commendation. A Bronze Star citation that describes the Firebase Kilo action in specific detail. And 14 living Marines whose testimony we can call if we need to." She leaned forward. "They want to make Firebase Kilo into a story about a woman who leaves people behind. We're going to make it into a story about a woman who made an impossible call and saved every life that could be saved." She held Claire's gaze. "The difference between those two stories is how you tell it. Not what happened, how you tell it." "I've never been good at that part," Claire said. "I know. That's why we're sitting here." Rashida sat in on the prep sessions and said very little, which was its own kind of support, the kind that didn't require anything back. On the 4th evening, she and Claire sat at Rashida's kitchen table, long after Marsh had gone and the building had gone quiet, and the specific stillness of a place where two people have stopped pretending settled around them. "You remember what you said to me the night before Firebase Kilo," Rashida said. It wasn't a question. It was the opening of something she'd been building to for days. "I told you to get some sleep." Before that, Claire looked at her coffee cup. "I said I wasn't sure I was making the right call. You said, if I'm wrong about this, I'm going to carry it forever." Rashida's voice was steady. "And I told you that the mark of a good commander wasn't never being wrong. It was being honest about the possibility and making the call anyway." She paused. "You've been carrying it like you were wrong." "But you weren't wrong, Claire. The firebase fell 11 minutes after we cleared the perimeter. 11 minutes. Nothing you could have done in 11 minutes would have changed what happened to those 6 men." She looked at her directly. You've been paying a debt you don't owe. The kitchen was quiet. I know that, Claire said. Knowing it and believing it aren't the same thing. No, Rashida said, they're not. But you've got people in that courtroom who are counting on you to get close enough to believing it that it shows. The grand jury proceedings were closed. Claire walked in on a Tuesday morning in her best clothes, which was a dark blazer over a plain shirt, and her crutch, which she'd stopped being self-conscious about somewhere around day 5 of recovery. And she sat in the witness chair and looked at 23 ordinary people who were going to decide whether James Calloway answered for what he'd done. Marsh led her through it chronologically. The diner, the wound, the hospital, Holt's visit, the settlement offer, Rashida's text, Maya's research, the men in the maintenance corridor, the county road, Tyler bleeding on gravel while Marcus stood over him. She told it all in the same order every time, complete and clear. And when Marsh asked her about Firebase Kilo, she told that too, the way it had happened, including the part where she'd heard the firefight start behind her and kept walking, because that was the truth, and the truth was the only thing she had that couldn't be taken away from her. When she finished, the room was quiet, in the specific way rooms went quiet when everyone in them had just heard something they weren't going to forget. The defense had 40 minutes with her. Calloway's lead attorney was a man named Philip Carruth, 60 years old, silver-suited, with the smooth, unhurried confidence of someone who had been taking things apart in courtrooms for 3 decades and had learned that patience was more effective than aggression. He started gently. Ms. Maddox, you were diagnosed with post-traumatic stress disorder following your military discharge. Is that correct? Yes. And PTSD can affect perception, cause a person to interpret neutral situations as threatening. In some cases, yes. In your case specifically, has that occurred? Not in any way that's relevant to what I've testified to today. Carruth smiled like she'd said something interesting. You launched yourself across a restaurant at a man who, to that point, had not fired his weapon. His finger was on the trigger, and he was in the process of raising the weapon toward a Marine's head. In your interpretation, in the interpretation of the security footage that was viewed by approximately 40 million people. Claire kept her voice level. I'm happy to defer to the consensus. Carruth moved on without acknowledging the answer. Firebase Kilo. You testified that you ordered 6 Marines to hold a perimeter while you evacuated with the wounded. That's correct. Those 6 Marines died. Yes. And you survived, along with 14 others who would not have survived without the evacuation. She looked at him steadily. Would you like me to provide their names? Carruth paused for exactly the length of time it took to recalibrate. It was a small pause, but Claire saw it, and Marsh saw it, and at least 3 of the grand jurors leaned slightly forward in a way that meant they'd seen it too. You've described Senator Calloway as the source of funds flowing through a series of shell companies to Warren Holt, and ultimately to the robbery network, Carruth said. But you have no direct financial evidence of that connection. What you have is the testimony of a 22-year-old with 3 prior arrests who is cooperating in exchange for reduced charges. I also have the testimony of my own eyes regarding what Warren Holt did when he walked into my hospital room and tried to purchase my silence. She held Carruth's gaze. When a man moves that fast to bury a story, he's not protecting an institution. He's protecting something specific. I didn't know what it was when he walked in. I knew it before he walked out. You're describing intuition. I'm describing 20 years of training in reading human behavior under pressure. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. Mr. Carruth, your client hired operatives who put a 4-inch gash in a woman's head and pointed a weapon at an unarmed 22-year-old on a rural road at midnight. That's not intuition. That's evidence. And the man who made those calls is sitting in this building right now, hoping I'm too broken to explain it clearly. She looked at him without blinking. I'm not too broken. I'm the clearest I've been in 3 years. The pause this time was longer. No further questions, Carruth said. The grand jury deliberated for 6 hours. Claire spent those 6 hours in a waiting room with Rashida and Danny and Cross, who had driven back from her base for the third time in 8 days because, as she put it, she had unfinished business with this county and intended to see it through. They talked, and they didn't talk in equal measure. Danny told a story about his first week of basic training that made Rashida laugh, in spite of everything. Rashida told one back that made Danny go red. Cross sat with perfect posture and drank terrible vending machine coffee and said almost nothing, and the quality of her silence was the kind that made the room feel steadier. At 4:47 in the afternoon, Marsh came into the waiting room with her jacket still on, and her expression controlled and said, "True, Bill. All counts. Calloway's being taken into custody." Nobody cheered. It wasn't that kind of moment. It was the kind of moment that sat heavy and clean at the same time, like something that had been wrong for a long time had just been named correctly. Danny let out a long, slow breath. Rashida pressed her fingers against the edge of the table and looked at the ceiling. Cross looked at Claire and gave one precise nod. "Holt," Claire said to Marsh, "pleaded this morning. 32 counts, full cooperation agreement. He gave us everything on Calloway in exchange for reduced sentencing." Marsh's voice was efficient and steady. He also confirmed that the camera access provided to Voss's operatives came directly from him. He's looking at 12 years minimum. "Tyler?" Marsh's expression shifted slightly. "Cooperating witness. He'll serve time. But his attorney negotiated significantly reduced exposure in exchange for the testimony and the account numbers." She paused. "He asked me to tell you something." Claire waited. "He said he's sorry he didn't put the gun down at the diner." The arrest made every major network by 6 o'clock. Maya Osei's story went live at 6:15, timed to the minute. The full 6 months of investigation compressed into a piece that laid out the entire network from Calloway down to the Harlan County diner, with a kind of documented precision that left no room for alternative interpretation. By 8 o'clock, it had been read by more people than lived in West Virginia. Claire watched none of it. She was in Rashida's apartment eating the first real meal she'd had in 8 days, something Rashida had cooked from actual ingredients. And the television was off, and her phone was face down on the counter, and for 1 hour she just sat at a table and ate food and let herself exist without managing anything. Her phone buzzed. She turned it over. A text from a number she didn't recognize, a 540 area code, 2 sentences. "My name is Margaret Adkins. Sergeant First Class David Adkins was my husband. I saw the news today. I need to speak with you, if you're willing." Claire set the phone down very carefully. Rashida was watching her from across the table. "Who is it?" "Adkins's wife." Claire's voice came out steady, which surprised her. "Firebase Kilo. He was the one I told to hold the perimeter." The apartment was quiet. "Are you going to call her back?" Rashida asked. Claire looked at the phone for a long moment. 3 years she had avoided this exact thing, had moved across the state and changed her number and built a life out of deliberate invisibility, specifically so that she would never have to sit in a room and explain to someone why their husband hadn't come home while she had. She had believed, with the specific conviction of someone who has never tested a belief, that she couldn't survive that conversation. She picked up the phone. She hit call. Margaret Adkins answered on the second ring. She sounded like someone who had been waiting for a call for a long time and had learned not to hope too hard that it would come. "Thank you for calling," she said. "I should have called a long time ago." Claire closed her eyes. "I'm sorry. For all of it. I'm not calling to make you feel worse." Margaret's voice was measured and careful. The voice of a woman who had processed something enormous over a long period of time and had found a way to carry it that worked. "I'm calling because I watched what happened to you this week. The diner, the hospital, the courthouse." A pause. "David would have done the same thing, exactly the same. He would have been the one throwing himself across that restaurant. That was who he was." Her voice didn't break, but it thickened slightly. I needed you to know that what you built out of what happened, that nonprofit you talked about in the interview, the Kilo Initiative, he would have wanted his name on something like that. Claire couldn't speak for a moment. You gave the order because it was the right order, Margaret said quietly. David followed it because he was a Marine, and because he trusted you, and because he knew what it meant to hold a line so other people could get clear. He made that choice, not you. She paused. I've been wanting to say that to you for 3 years. The thing that had lived in Claire's chest since the night she walked out of that firebase cracked open and rearranged itself into something that wasn't forgiveness exactly, because she wasn't sure she'd ever be fully done with what she carried, but was something adjacent to it, something that breathed differently. Thank you, she said. It was inadequate. It was all she had. Come see me sometime, Margaret Adkins said. When this is all done, David talked about you. I'd like to know the person he talked about. Cross called at 9 o'clock. The Marine Corps is submitting a formal commendation, she said. Your actions over the past 8 days, protecting a fellow Marine at the diner, cooperating with a federal investigation, testifying before a grand jury against a state senator. It's being written up. A pause. There's also something else. I've had enough somethings else this week. This one's different. Cross's voice shifted register slightly, losing the crisp command authority and becoming something more direct, more human. General Sarah Kimball at Quantico has been following this case. She reached out to my office today. She wants to know if you've considered coming back. Claire was quiet. Not combat, not field service. She's looking at a curriculum position, crisis response training, teaching the next generation of combat medics what you know. Cross let that sit for a moment. She said specifically that she read the interview you did with Maya Osei, the part where you talked about what you'd do with everything you'd learned if you were building something from scratch. She wants to know if you meant it. Claire looked at the wall. 3 years ago, she had walked out of a discharge office and driven until the miles put enough distance between her and everything she'd been, and she had found Harlan County and a hospital that needed nurses, and a county that didn't ask questions. And she had built a life from the outside in, structure first, identity later. And she had believed that was healing. She understood now that it had been waiting. Tell General Kimball, Claire said slowly, that I have a better idea. I'm listening, Cross said. Not a curriculum position, not a teaching slot inside an existing structure. She sat forward. Something independent, something that serves veterans and civilians both. Crisis response, threat assessment, trauma-informed emergency training. Something named after the people who showed me what it cost to be unprepared. She paused. Something called the Kilo Initiative. Cross was quiet for 3 seconds. I think, she said finally, that General Kimball is going to want to meet you in person. I think I'm ready for that. She set the phone down and looked at Rashida, who had been listening from the kitchen doorway with the particular expression she wore when something was happening that she had been waiting for longer than the person it was happening to had been waiting. Well, Rashida said. Well, Claire said. Outside, Harlan County was settling into an ordinary October night, the kind it had been having for 100 years before any of this, the kind it would keep having long after. But the woman sitting at Rashida's kitchen table was not the woman who had moved here 3 years ago with a plan to become invisible and a wound she'd decided to carry alone. That woman had been holding her breath since Firebase Kilo. She was done holding it. General Sarah Kimball drove herself to Harlan County. No aide, no driver, just a government sedan and 4 hours of Virginia highway, and a woman who had decided that some conversations deserved the courtesy of being had in person. She arrived on a Thursday morning 2 weeks after the grand jury, knocked on the door of the Sheriff's Department conference room where Claire had been using a borrowed desk to draft the Kilo Initiative proposal, and sat down across from her with the specific economy of movement that very senior officers developed when they'd stop needing to perform authority because they'd simply become it. She was 61 years old, 2 stars, eyes that had seen enough to stop being surprised by most things, and had settled into a quality that wasn't hardness exactly, more like accuracy. She read through the proposal for 12 minutes without speaking. Claire let her read. "This is serious," Kimball said finally. "I know what it costs to be unprepared," Claire said. "I've been paying that bill for 3 years." Kimball set the proposal down. "The Marine Corps can't officially sponsor an independent nonprofit. You know that. I'm not asking for sponsorship. I'm asking for partnership. Retired instructors who want to teach. Training facilities during non-peak hours. A formal endorsement that opens doors with other funders." Claire held her gaze. "What I'm building isn't a military program. It's a bridge. Veterans who know how to respond to violence, teaching civilians who don't. Teachers, nurses, first responders, parents." She paused. "People who might be sitting in a diner someday." Kimball looked at her for a long moment. "You understand that Calloway's trial is 8 months out. His attorneys are going to come at you again, harder than the grand jury. A full courtroom, cross-examination, cameras outside." She leaned forward slightly. "You're going to be building this while that's happening. I know, and you're still committed." "I've been uncommitted for 3 years," Claire said. "I know what that costs too." Kimball pulled a card from her jacket and set it on the table. "My direct line, not my office, me." She stood. "I'll have a formal partnership proposal from the Marine Corps to you within the week. Facilities access at Quantico and 2 regional bases. 4 retired instructors who've already expressed interest when I put out a quiet inquiry last week." She paused at the door. "I put out that inquiry before I drove here." Claire looked at the card. "You were sure I'd say yes." "I was sure you'd already decided." Kimball's expression held something that was almost a smile. "You decided the night of the grand jury, maybe before. You just needed someone to show up and confirm that the door was open." She looked at her steadily. "It's been open for 3 years, Staff Sergeant. You just couldn't see it from where you were standing." She left. The room was quiet. Claire looked at the card and then at the 40-page proposal she'd written in 2 weeks on a borrowed desk in a county sheriff's building, and she felt something she hadn't expected to feel, which was that she was not afraid. The Kilo Initiative opened its first training facility on a cold Saturday in February in a converted warehouse on the east side of Harlan that a local property owner had donated for the first year after reading Maya Osei's Washington Post piece and calling the number at the bottom of the article 3 times before anyone answered. 60 people showed up for the opening session. Claire had planned for 40. Rashida ran the first tactical response module. She stood in front of a room of nurses, teachers, a school librarian, 2 county EMTs, and a retired coal miner who said he'd been wanting to learn this stuff since 1987. And she taught with a specific combination of technical precision and human directness that made people lean forward instead of back. Danny Reeves was there. His enlistment had ended in January, and he'd driven from Camp Lejeune with 2 duffel bags and a willingness to work for a salary that made Helen Marsh, who had heard about the Kilo Initiative through Hartwell and sent a personal donation, wince slightly when Claire mentioned it. He ran the physical response module with a kind of patient persistence that was better in a teaching context than intensity, and by the end of the first session, 3 of his students had asked when the next one was. Claire taught the threat assessment module herself. She stood in front of 60 people who had never been in a combat zone, and she told them the truth about what violence looked like before it happened, how it moved, how it telegraphed itself, how the body knew things before the brain caught up. She told them about the diner. She told them about the 3 variables she'd run in the seconds before she moved. She did not tell them to become fighters. She told them to become people who did not freeze. At the end of the session, a woman in her 50s approached her, a middle school principal from Pikeville, 40 minutes east. She had attended alone and taken notes on everything, and had the expression of someone who had been thinking about a specific problem for a long time, and had just been handed a tool that fitted. "I want to bring this to my staff," the woman said. "All of it. When can I schedule a session?" "Call the number on the card," Claire said. "We'll make it work." The call came on a Tuesday in March, 4 months after the grand jury, 3 weeks before the Kilo Initiative's second facility was scheduled to open in Charleston. Claire was in a budget meeting with Rashida and a grant writer named Tom, who had been recommended by General Kimball's office and had turned out to be worth every dollar of his fee, when her phone buzzed with Marsh's number. She stepped into the hallway and answered. "Calloway is filing a motion to dismiss," Marsh said. "New grounds. His attorneys got access to a psychological evaluation that was conducted during your VA intake process 7 years ago, before Firebase Kilo. They're arguing it demonstrates a pre-existing pattern of dissociative response under stress, and they're using it to challenge the reliability of everything you testified to." Claire leaned against the wall. "That evaluation was voluntary intake screening. Every returning soldier does it. I know that. The judge will know that. But it's going to take time to argue through. And in the meantime, his attorneys are going to leak the existence of it to every outlet they can reach." Marsh's voice was controlled and factual, in the way it always was when she was managing something that would have been easier to be upset about. "It'll be on 3 networks by 6 o'clock tonight. What do you need from me?" "Nothing tonight. Stay off the phone with press. Let me handle the legal response." A pause. "But I need to know that when this goes to trial in 4 months, you're going to be on that stand, and you're going to be exactly what you were in front of the grand jury." "I'm going to be better than I was in front of the grand jury," Claire said, "because I'm not going to be ashamed of a single word of it." The leak landed at 5:58. By 7, it was the leading story on 2 networks and the dominant topic on every social media platform that covered the case. The framing was exactly what Marsh had predicted: decorated veteran or damaged witness. The question presented as if it had 2 equally valid answers. Danny called at 7:30. "Don't watch it." "I'm not watching it." "I know you. You're watching it." She turned the television off. "I'm not watching it anymore." "Good." His voice was steady, the voice he'd developed over the past 4 months of working alongside her, which was quieter than the voice he'd arrived with, and more certain of its own weight. "The comments on Maya's article are running about 4-1 in your favor, for what it's worth. It's not worth much in a courtroom." "No, but it's worth something to the 63 people who just registered for the April session." He paused. "Someone named Sarah Denton from Pikeville registered 14 staff members from her school, the middle school principal." Claire sat with that for a moment. "They're not going to stop coming because Calloway's attorneys leaked a screening form," Danny said. "The people signing up for Kilo Initiative sessions, they saw what you did in that diner. They read what you built. That's not something a leaked document undoes." He paused again. "I'm just saying." "I know what you're saying." "Okay." She could hear him moving around, the background sounds of the Harlan facility, which had become as familiar to her as any place she'd lived. Rashida made chili. "There's enough. You should come eat." She went. The trial of James Calloway began on a Monday in June with a media presence that transformed the Charleston Federal Courthouse into something resembling a very organized siege. Cameras on every approach, reporters doing live reports from the sidewalk, protesters both for and against the prosecution, occupying opposite corners with the careful separation that came from a strong police presence and a mutual understanding that the other side was watching. Claire walked through all of it on her crutch, which she still used for long distances, though the leg had healed to the point where she didn't need it for short ones. And she did not look at the cameras, and she did not respond to the questions that were shouted from both directions, and she did not slow down. Cross was waiting on the courthouse steps, in uniform. Behind her, in a line that extended down both sides of the steps and curved around the corner of the building, were Marines. 47 of them, Cross had told her that morning on the phone, from 3 different units across 2 states, who had requested personal leave to be present at the trial of the man who had tried to silence a fellow veteran. Claire stopped when she saw them. Cross came down 3 steps and stood in front of her. "You have people," she said simply. Claire looked at the line of them, the disciplined posture, the dress uniforms, the faces she didn't know but recognized anyway. The way you recognize something you'd been part of for long enough that it became structural, part of how you understood the world. Danny was at the far end of the line in civilian clothes because he was a civilian now, and he gave her a single nod. Rashida was beside him. "Let's go," Claire said. Marsh had told her the trial would be ugly, and it was. Carruth had spent 4 months preparing for Claire's testimony, and it showed. He came at Firebase Kilo with everything he had, spending 2 hours on the sequence of events, the order she'd given, the 6 men who had stayed, the decisions she had made and walked away from. He was skilled and thorough and relentless in the specific way that good defense attorneys were relentless. Not hostile exactly, just persistent, returning to the same points from different angles until the accumulated weight of them was supposed to press something loose. It didn't press anything loose. Claire had spent 4 months building something real with her hands and her knowledge and the people who had chosen to stand beside her. She had spent 4 months teaching 60, then 100, then 200 people how to survive situations they hoped they'd never face. She had spent 4 months being exactly who she was, without apology, without management, without the 3 years of careful smallness that had preceded it. And the result was that she sat in that witness chair and told the truth about Firebase Kilo in the same voice she used to teach threat assessment in a Harlan County warehouse. Clear and complete, and without a single moment of shame. "You ordered 6 Marines to hold a perimeter while you withdrew," Carruth said. "I ordered 6 Marines to hold a perimeter while I evacuated 14 men who would have died from their wounds within the hour. Yes. And those 6 men died. They died giving 14 other men a chance to live. That is what happened at Firebase Kilo." She looked at him steadily. "If you want to argue that I should have made a different call, you need to explain which 14 men I should have left to die instead. I've been waiting 3 years for someone to answer that question. No one has managed it yet." The courtroom was very quiet. Carruth moved to his next point. He didn't have an answer. The jury deliberated for 2 days. Claire spent both days at the Kilo Initiative facility in Charleston, the second one that had opened in March, because sitting still was not something she did well, and because there were 3 sessions scheduled, and the students who had registered for them had registered before James Calloway became the reason she was in Charleston, and deserved the same thing every other student got. On the second afternoon, during a break between sessions, Marsh called. "Verdict's in," she said. "How long did I have?" 10 minutes, the clerk just called. A pause. "You need to be in the courtroom in 30. Claire looked at the group of first responders she'd been working with for the past 2 hours, 12 of them, EMTs and firefighters, and a county paramedic who had driven 90 minutes because the nearest session to her home county had a 6-week wait list. "I have to go," she told them. "Same time next week. Rashida will cover the final module." The paramedic stopped her at the door. "Miss Maddox." She was young, maybe 26, with the serious eyes of someone who had seen things on rural roads that most people never saw. "What you're doing here, it matters. I just wanted to say that." Claire looked at her for a moment. "Thank you," she said. "Come back next week." The courtroom was full. The 47 Marines had not been permitted inside for the verdict, but they were on the steps and in the lobby and in the corridors, and their presence was a physical fact that the building organized itself around. Claire took her seat beside Marsh and looked straight ahead. James Calloway sat at the defense table in the same expensive suit he'd worn every day of the trial. He had maintained throughout the proceedings the composure of a man who believed that enough money and enough lawyers could hold any structure together indefinitely. He did not look at Claire when she came in. The jury filed in. 20 people who had listened for 3 weeks and deliberated for 2 days and were about to close a door that a lot of people in this building had spent a long time trying to keep open. "Has the jury reached a verdict?" the judge asked. "We have, Your Honor." The foreperson was a woman in her 60s, a retired school administrator from Kanawha County, who held the verdict forms with both hands and read in a voice that was clear and without drama because the facts themselves were dramatic enough, and she knew it. "On the count of conspiracy to commit racketeering, we, the jury, find the defendant guilty." Calloway's composure held. "On the count of money laundering in the first degree, we, the jury, find the defendant guilty." One of his attorneys made a note. "On the count of conspiracy to commit witness intimidation, we, the jury, find the defendant guilty." The second attorney stopped writing. "On the count of accessory to assault on a federal witness, we, the jury, find the defendant guilty." Carruth put his pen down. The foreperson continued through 9 more counts. Guilty on every one. The word accumulated in the courtroom like something physical, pressing against the walls, filling the space between everything that had been said and done over the past 8 months, settling finally into the specific weight of a thing that had been true all along and was now officially known. When the last count was read, Calloway turned and looked at Claire for the first time since the trial began. She had expected anger. She had expected the cold calculations she'd seen in every interaction with men like him, men who used power as a buffer between themselves and consequences, and were genuinely surprised when the buffer failed. She hadn't expected what she actually saw, which was something smaller and more human than any of that. Just a man who had spent 30 years believing he was the permanent exception to every rule, and had finally reached the rule he wasn't the exception to. She held his gaze for 2 seconds. Then she looked away, because he had taken enough of her attention, and she was done giving him more. Marsh leaned toward her. "Sentencing in 6 weeks. The prosecution is recommending 40 years. Given the counts and his lack of cooperation, the judge will likely be within 5 years of that." She paused. "It's over." "I know," Claire said. The Marines on the courthouse steps knew before Claire came through the doors, because news moved fast in buildings full of people watching their phones. When she came out, the line was still there, still organized, and Cross was still at the top of the steps. And the thing that happened didn't require any words to arrange itself. Cross came to attention first, and the sound of 47 people following her in sequence was a sound that lived in Claire's bones from a different life, sharp and precise, and entirely without ambiguity. Claire stopped at the top of the steps. She didn't cry. She had decided somewhere in the past several months that what she felt in moments like these was too large for crying, that it belonged to a category of experience that didn't have a conventional outlet, that the right response to it was to stand up straight and feel all of it without flinching. She stood up straight. She felt all of it. Danny was grinning. Rashida had her arms crossed and her chin up, and the expression she wore when something had turned out the way it was supposed to. Maya Osei was at the edge of the group with her phone in her hand, recording, but when Claire caught her eye, she put the phone down and just stood there, present, which was the right thing. Cross lowered her salute. "Well done, Staff Sergeant." "We're not done," Claire said. "No," Cross agreed, "but today we're allowed to acknowledge what we finished." 2 months after the sentencing, which landed at 38 years without possibility of parole, Claire drove to Lexington, Kentucky to meet Margaret Adkins in person. Margaret lived in a small house on a street lined with old trees, and she answered the door before Claire finished knocking, which meant she'd been watching. She was 62 years old, and she looked like a woman who had carried something enormous for a long time and had learned to carry it with her shoulders level. She brought Claire inside and made coffee, and they sat at a kitchen table very similar to Rashida's and talked for 3 hours. Margaret had photographs. David Adkins at 22 in his first uniform, At 30, in full gear outside a firebase in Afghanistan. At 34, with Margaret at their son's birthday party 6 months before Firebase Kilo. Claire looked at every one of them. She asked questions. She listened to the answers. Toward the end of the third hour, Margaret said, "He wrote about you in his letters." She got up and came back with an envelope, worn at the corners, and set it on the table between them. "He said you were the best combat medic he'd ever served with. Said you made decisions the way people who knew what they were doing made decisions. Quick and clear and without drama." She paused. "He said he trusted you completely." Claire looked at the envelope. "He wanted you to have that," Margaret said. "He wrote it before the last deployment. Said if anything happened, there were people who should know he trusted them." She nodded at the envelope. "Your name was on the list." The letter was 2 pages. She didn't read it at the table. She read it in her car, parked on Margaret Street, with the October air cold outside, and the old trees doing what old trees did in October. And she read it twice, and then she folded it carefully and put it in the inside pocket of her jacket where she would keep it. David Adkins had written that he'd seen a lot of people make calls under pressure, and most of them flinched at the moment it cost something. He had written that she didn't flinch. He had written that in the kind of situation Firebase Kilo became, the difference between someone who flinched and someone who didn't was the difference between 14 men living and 20 dying. And he had written that he was proud to serve alongside someone who understood that. He had written, "Whatever happens on that perimeter, you did right by your people. Don't you let anyone tell you different, not even yourself." Claire sat with that for a long time. Then she started the car and drove back to Harlan County because she had a session at 7 o'clock and 30 people who had registered to learn something that mattered, and she was not going to be late. The Kilo Initiative held its 1-year anniversary session on a Saturday in February in the original Harlan County warehouse, which had been expanded twice since it opened and was still not large enough for everyone who wanted to be there. Claire stood in front of a room of 240 people, the largest single session they'd ever run, and she looked out at the faces: nurses, teachers, veterans, parents, first responders, ordinary people who had decided that being unprepared was a choice they weren't willing to make. And she felt the particular quality of weight that came from something being exactly what it was supposed to be. Rashida was in the back with her arms crossed, watching with the expression she reserved for things she had believed in before they were real. Danny was at the side door, keeping the overflow crowd informed about timing for the second session. Cross had sent a letter that Rashida had taped to the wall beside the door. Formal Marine Corps letterhead, 1 paragraph, expressing the Corps' continuing partnership with the Kilo Initiative and its founding director. General Kimball had signed it personally. Maya Osei was in the 3rd row. She had come every quarter since the opening. She was working on a book. Claire had agreed to cooperate with it on the same terms she'd given the original interview. Her words, her control, her story. Margaret Adkins was in the 5th row. She had driven from Lexington and was going to stay the weekend, and they were going to have dinner on Sunday. The way they had started doing every few months, the kind of regular, ordinary human thing that Claire had not had in her life for a long time and had discovered she needed. Claire stepped up to the front of the room. She looked at the faces in front of her, and she thought about a diner on a cold October morning and a young Marine at a counter, and a choice made in 3 seconds that had cost her 3 years of hiding and given her everything else. She thought about 6 men on a perimeter and 14 men who came home, and a letter folded in the inside pocket of her jacket that she had read so many times she could have recited it. She thought about all the things she had believed she owed the world. Silence and smallness, and the careful invisibility of someone who has decided their presence is more liability than asset. And she thought about how wrong she had been about all of it, how completely and unnecessarily wrong. She set her crutch against the wall. She didn't need it for standing still. "My name is Claire Maddox," she said. I'm a former Army Ranger medic. I'm a nurse. I'm the founder of the Kilo Initiative. And I'm going to teach you something today that I learned the hard way. In places most of you will never have to go, at a cost I wouldn't wish on anyone. She looked out at them. I'm going to teach you that the most dangerous thing you can do in a crisis is nothing. That hesitation costs lives. That training is the difference between surviving something and being destroyed by it. She paused. And I'm going to teach you that the person who acts when everyone else freezes doesn't have to be special. They just have to be ready. She picked up the marker. She turned to the board, and Claire Maddox, who had spent 3 years making herself invisible, began the work of making sure no one who sat in her classroom would ever have to make the choice she'd made alone. That was the mission. That was always going to be the mission. She just had to stop running long enough to find it.